So here's our second day on completing the square, that process for solving quadratic equations that combines factoring and square roots. We saw the basics of it yesterday in the last lesson. You got your feet wet. Now we're just going to make sure that you fully understand how to do it with all of our different possibilities that might pop up. So just as a warm-up here, go ahead and just practice completing this square, right? Make this into a perfect square trinomial. What number would have to go in that blank to make it a perfect square trinomial? We practiced this in the last lesson. So remember, the first process in completing that perfect square trinomial is to open up your bin squared parentheses, right? We start by saying, all right, what times itself would give me that first term? Since that's a squared, I'm trying to figure out what is a in my parentheses, and that would be x, okay? I take that middle term, I divide it by 2, because since this is 2ab, I want to get rid of that 2, so then I can figure out what is just a times b. Negative 18x divided by 2 is negative 9x. Watch your negatives, right? Okay, so this is now a times b, and I know that a is x. So what times x gives me negative 9x? And the answer is negative 9. So b in my parentheses must be negative 9. And then to fill in that perfect square trinomial, that last blank is b squared. So negative 9 squared gives me positive 81. So 81 is the number that should go into that blank. And that was the quick rundown of the process, right? Now, we only did one of these yesterday, but hopefully you remember what happens. Same process, even if there's a number in front of x squared, you can do it. So you say, okay, what times itself gives me 4x squared? That would be 2x, right? Then I take this middle term, and I divide it by 2, and I get positive 6x. Now remember, what you're thinking here is 2x times what gives me negative 6x. Whoops, got a crazy color there. Since 6x is a times b, you're thinking 2x times what equals 6x. 2x times 3 equals 6x. So this has to be positive 3 as my second number in my parentheses. Since the first term a wasn't just x, it was 2x, then that second term isn't just 6. It's 2x times what gives me 6x. So 2x times 3. Now I take that second term and I square it to fill in my blank. So 3 squared gives me 9. So correct answer there is positive 9. All right, so remember, that's the big part of the process in solving by completing the squares. You have to complete that perfect square trinomial. So let's remember the rest of the process here. So the first part is to actually rewrite your equation, but add a blank on both sides so I can do that process of completing the square that we just talked about and then use it to solve, right? So I added a blank on both sides, but now I do exactly the same thing that we were just doing. I open my bin squared parentheses. What times itself gives me that first term? That would have to be x. Divide my middle term by 2. 6x divided by 2 is 3x. Since my first term was x, x times what gives me 3x? X times positive 3 gives me 3x. Take that second term and I square it to fill in the blank. 3 squared gives me 9. Now if I put something in the blank on the left, I have to add the same thing on the right to keep my equation balanced. Now in doing that process, I have actually finished factoring in my second step already. Factoring is done. Awesome. But all I need to do is do my adding on the right. 27 plus 9 gives me 36. All right, so I have my binomial squared, the parentheses squared, all alone over on the left. So in order to get rid of that squared, I could just square root both sides. Squared and square root cancel out. I have x plus 3 equals, let's see, what times itself gives me 36? Could be positive 6, or it could be negative 6. So remember, you have those two possibilities, plus or minus, after you write the square root to solve, right? Don't forget them both, and like I always say, I highly recommend you write them next to each other when you're in a situation like this, because we're not done solving yet. I have to subtract 3 from both options here. So my final answers, my possibilities for x could be positive 3 or it could be negative 9. So that was straight up review of what you had learned in yesterday's lesson. All right, let's see what number 2 is going to give us. So first step, same thing. Whoops. Rewrite by adding a blank on both sides. Open up that bin squared parentheses. And let's start solving. So let's see. What times itself gives me x squared? That would be x. Take that middle term and divide it by 2. Ooh, careful here. Negative 2x divided by 2 would be negative 1x, right? Or just negative x, however you want to think about it. But I would recommend writing it as negative 1x. All right, so a is x. A times b is negative 1x. So x times what gives me negative 1x? X times negative 1, right? All right, so since b is negative 1, I need to take that number and square it to fill in the blank. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Remember, whatever goes in this blank should never be a negative number because you are squaring that second term in your parentheses. All right, that next step is already done for me on the left. The factoring is finished. All I have to do is add my two numbers on the right. 1 plus 1 gives me 2. Awesome. Okay, now I have my binomial squared all by itself on the left-hand side. All I have to do is get rid of that squared by taking the square root of each one. Square root and squared cancel out, so on the left I have x minus 1. Ooh. Now, this is tricky. Square root of 2. Ooh, 2's not a perfect square. Don't worry, you know what to do here. We spent an entire unit on this. Unit 5, simplifying radicals, right? It's okay if it's not a perfect square. Now in this one, I can't simplify the square root of 2. So I still have the square root of 2 as a possibility, but I also have the negative square root of 2. Don't forget your plus or minus, right? You can write this as plus or minus radical 2 if you want to, right? That's definitely okay. You can write it either way. Just remember, though, you're not finished yet. Now we need to add 1 to our possibilities. I need to get that x by itself. Now remember that whenever you have something outside of the parenthesis, or outside of the radical, whenever you have something outside of the radical, you have to write it in front of the radical. We learned this back in our first lesson, but just as a reminder, because if you don't write it in front, then I'm not sure, were you just sloppy in your work? Is that one supposed to be inside or outside? I don't know. So anything that's on the outside of a radical has to be written in front. So if you were going to do that, so I'm going to get this option out of the way a little bit here, scooch it down. If you were going to do that, it would say x equals 1 plus radical 2, because this one is a positive radical 2, or 1 minus radical 2. The 1 is positive either way, right? 1 plus radical 2 or 1 minus radical 2. Now, if you wrote it with the plus or minus symbol right away and you added 1, then that would mean that I would get an answer of x equals 1 plus or minus radical 2. So maybe it helps you a little bit when you don't have a perfect square, right? If you have this radical that's staying in your answer, to actually write it with the plus or minus symbol, that might help you a little bit. And then just remember, anything that you move over after that has to go in front of that plus or minus radical that you have. So this second option might be a better way to go if there's a radical staying in your answer, if it's not a perfect square. All right, like I said, we were kicking it up today, but same process, right? So let's start that process for number 3. So rewrite here, but add a blank on each side so I can complete my perfect square trinomial. Open up those bin squared parentheses. Aha! Just like that second one in the warm-up today, right? I don't just have x squared this time, so be careful. Warning. Woo! Yellow light, you can do it. Here we go. What times itself gives me 36x squared? That would have to be 6x, right? 6x times 6x gives me 36x squared. All right, now I'm going to take this middle term and I'm going to divide it by 2. 36x divided by 2 is 18x. Now remember what you're thinking here. You're thinking 6x times what gives me 18x? 6x times 3 gives me 18x. So be careful, it's not an 18 in there because the first term was 6x, not just x. 6x times 3 gives me 18x. So now that I know that my second term is a 3, I'll take that 3 and I'll square it, and my blank goes a 9. If I add a 9 on the left, I have to add a 9 on the right as well. My left-hand side is already factored for us, so all I have to do is add on the right. 7 plus 9 gives me 16. All right, that's exciting because I know that that's a perfect square. So since I have my binomial squared by itself, I'll square root both sides. Squared and square root cancel, and I'll get 6x plus 3 equals, the square root of 16 is 4 or negative 4. And again, since that's not a radical, I'll probably write it next to each other rather than using that plus or minus. All right, now there's more to do on this one. First I have to subtract 3 from both possibilities. 4 minus 3 gives me 1. Negative 4 minus 3 gives me negative 7. But that's not it. Now I have to also divide both possibilities by 6. So x could equal 1/6 or x could equal negative 7/6. So it is okay to get fractions. Those are possibilities as well. All the possibilities in the world. Please don't write that as a decimal though. Leave it as a fraction. That decimal would get crazy. So please, 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 no decimals here. All right, if you can do that, you can do this last one. Let's check out our last option here. 9x squared minus 6x, add that blank to it, equals 8 plus the same blank. Open up our bin squared parentheses. What times itself gives me 9x squared? Has to be 3x. Take that middle term and divide it by 2. Negative 6x divided by 2 is negative 3x. Okay, now remember, be careful. A is not x. Our first term isn't just x. Our first term is 3x. So 3x times what gives me negative 3x? 3x times negative 1 gives me negative 3x. So that shouldn't be a negative 3 in those parentheses because my a was already 3x. So 3x times negative 1 gives me negative 3x. Now that I know that second term, I take that negative 1 and I square it, so I get negative 1 squared is positive 1 going in that blank on both sides. All right, left-hand side is already factored. All I have to do is add on the right. 8 plus 1 gives me 9, so I've got another possibility here where it's a perfect square. Hopefully you guys can finish this one out rocking and rolling. Hopefully you could do the whole thing by yourself without me, but just in case. Square root and squared cancel out, so I get 3x minus 1 equals positive 3 or negative 3. First thing I gotta do is add 1 to both of my possibilities, so I get 3x equals 4 or negative 2. And then I would divide both options by 3. So x could equal 4/3 or it could equal negative 2/3. So just another practice problem getting those fractions as your answers because it is a possibility and that's okay. All right, we have practiced all those different ones. Same process that we talked about yesterday. Big thing to remember today is it's okay if your square root is not a perfect square. It's all right. You know how to simplify those square roots. or maybe it's just going to stay how it is. And in that case, when you get a square root of a non-perfect square, I would probably recommend writing it with the plus or minus symbol instead of next to each other. And remember, anything that you have to move after that would have to go in front of that plus or minus radical, and that'll help you get the right answers on those.